The icy prison. The wind howled like a hungry beast, tearing through the frozen wasteland of planet X-473. Snow and ice swirled violently in the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature was so cold that any exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The land was dead. Nothing moved. Nothing survived here for long. Yet, in the middle of this frozen nightmare, something was moving. A figure lay half buried in the snow, her body curled up tightly, shivering violently. She was not human. Her skin, once a soft silver blue, was now covered in frost. Her long, thin fingers twitched weakly as she tried to move. Her glowing violet eyes were barely open, filled with pain and exhaustion. Her name was Sarah, and she was dying. She had been running for her life. But the cold had won. It always won. Her body had finally given up, her strength drained. Now the ice was claiming her. She could feel it creeping into her bones, stealing the last bit of warmth from her body. Her breath was shallow, her vision blurred. This was the end. Suddenly, the ground beneath her rumbled. A deep, eerie sound echoed through the storm. Something was shifting beneath the ice. Cracks began to form, stretching out like spider webs. Then, footsteps. A shadow appeared through the blizzard, moving closer. A figure, wrapped in thick thermal gear, carefully stepped forward. His visor glowed faintly against the storm, scanning the area. He held a plasma rifle, ready for danger. His name was Ethan Carter, a human explorer. He had been stranded on this planet for weeks, surviving alone, searching for any signs of life. And now he had found something. At first, Ethan thought it was just another frozen corpse. He had seen many during his time here. But then, a movement. The figure was still alive. He rushed forward, kneeling beside her. His helmet scanner flickered with information. Life signs, critical. Body temperature, dangerously low. Species, unknown. Ethan hesitated. Was she dangerous? He had no idea what kind of creature she was. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to survive much longer. Then the ice beneath her cracked louder. Ethan's eyes widened as the ground started to give way. The frozen surface was breaking apart, revealing the deep, dark abyss below. She was going to fall. Without thinking, Ethan lunged forward, grabbing her arm. She was ice cold, barely moving. Her violet eyes flickered open for just a second. She tried to speak, but her lips were too frozen to form words. Ethan pulled with all his strength, dragging her out of the collapsing ice. The ground behind them crumbled away, swallowed by the darkness below. Snow and ice crashed into the abyss, disappearing into the void. Ethan fell back, breathing heavily. She was still alive, but barely. Her weak breathing was the only sign that she hadn't given up completely. He looked down at her, frowning. Who was she? How had she ended up here? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered: getting her to safety. The storm howled louder, as if the planet itself was trying to stop him. But Ethan didn't care. He lifted her into his arms, her body limp and weightless. Then, without looking back, he walked into the storm. Somewhere in the distance, something watched them. Hidden in the blizzard, red eyes glowed in the dark. The wind carried a deep, inhuman growl. The hunt wasn't over yet. The rescue. Ethan moved as fast as the storm allowed, carrying the freezing alien woman in his arms. The icy wind bit at his exposed skin, but he ignored the pain. Each step through the thick snow was a battle. His boots sank deep into the frozen ground, and every few feet, he had to adjust his grip on her. She was light, too light, as if the cold had drained everything from her. The blizzard roared around them, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. His survival shelter was still a good distance away. It was a small outpost he had set up weeks ago, a simple metal structure half buried in the ice. It wasn't much, but it was warm. It had oxygen, supplies, and most importantly, a heating unit. She needed warmth. Fast. Ethan glanced down at her. Her silver-blue skin was covered in frost, her breath barely visible. Her violet eyes were closed, but now that she was out of the snow, he could see more of her features. She wasn't human, but she wasn't entirely alien either. She had a humanoid form. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that seemed almost familiar. But there were differences too. Her fingers were longer, more delicate. Her skin had a strange metallic sheen to it, reflecting the dim light of the storm. What was she? More importantly, who had left her to die out here? The wind howled again, louder this time. Ethan stopped. Something was wrong. Through the thick snowfall, a shadow moved. Ethan's heart pounded. His gloved hand instinctively reached for the plasma pistol strapped to his side. He adjusted his grip on the woman and carefully turned his head. Nothing. Just the storm. But he knew better. He wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, he pushed forward, walking faster now. The shelter wasn't far, if he could just make it inside. Then a low growl echoed through the storm. Ethan froze. The sound wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, and too close. His visor flickered with movement detection. Something was behind him. He turned, drawing his pistol. Red eyes. Glowing. Watching. Ethan's stomach tightened. There were 3 of them. Tall. Silent. Predators. The creatures stood on the frozen ridges above him, their outlines barely visible through the snow. Their eyes burned like fire against the white storm. They were watching him. Watching her. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and ran. His boots pounded against the ice, kicking up snow as he pushed his legs as hard as he could. The woman in his arms was dead weight, but he refused to drop her. He could hear the creatures moving behind him, fast and silent, like trained hunters. The shelter was in sight now, just ahead. A small metallic structure, half buried in the snowdrift. The door was open. He leaped inside, slamming the door shut behind him. For a moment, there was only silence. Ethan locked the door, gasping for breath. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned to the woman. She wasn't moving. His hands shook as he hurried to the heating unit, setting her down on the soft thermal mat. He cranked up the temperature, watching as warm air filled the tiny space. He kneeled beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her cold skin. Her heart was still beating. Barely. "Come on. Don't die on me," Ethan muttered, rubbing warmth into her frozen hands. Her breathing was slow, uneven. She was fighting for her life. Then her body twitched. Ethan pulled back as her fingers curled slightly. Her lips parted, and a faint whisper escaped. A single word. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. She was trying to speak. Her voice was weak, broken, but he could hear it. One word. One name. Sarah. Then her glowing violet eyes opened. And Ethan knew his problems had just begun. The awakening. The small shelter hummed softly as warm air spread through the confined space. The storm outside still howled, slamming against the metal walls. But in here it was safe, for now. Ethan knelt beside the mysterious alien woman. Sarah. That was the name she had whispered before falling unconscious again. He wasn't sure if she had meant it as her name or something else. But for now, it was the only thing he had to go on. Her body had stopped shivering, but her skin still looked too pale, too fragile. The metallic sheen on her arms flickered faintly under the artificial light, like it was trying to absorb the warmth. Her breath was shallow but steady. She was alive. Barely. Ethan sat back, running a hand through his damp hair. His heart was still pounding from the chase. The creatures in the storm, they weren't just animals. They were hunting her. Why? What was she to them? More importantly, why was she left to die out there? Ethan reached for his datapad, activating the biometric scanner. He needed answers. The screen flickered, scanning her body with a soft blue light. Numbers and symbols scrolled across the display. Unknown species, Unknown origin. Life signs stabilizing. And then, something unexpected. DNA match. 7% human. Ethan frowned. That can't be right. He double-checked the scan, but the results didn't change. She shared some genetic similarities with humans. Not much, but enough to raise questions. Was she connected to Earth somehow? Before he could think further, she stirred. A sharp breath. A twitch of her fingers. Then her eyes snapped open. Glowing violet. Alive. Terrified. Sarah bolted upright, gasping. She pressed against the wall, eyes darting around the room, searching for threats. Ethan raised his hand slowly. Hey, easy. You're safe. She turned to him, breathing heavily. Her body trembled, but not from the cold, from fear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her violet eyes locked onto his, scanning him like she was trying to decide whether to trust him or attack. Then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, weak, but clear. Where am I? Ethan exhaled, relieved that she could speak his language, at least somewhat. You're in my shelter. You were freezing to death out there. I brought you in. Her breathing steadied. She looked down at herself, at the blanket wrapped around her, then back at him. Her expression softened, confusion replacing fear. You saved me. Ethan nodded. Yeah, you were half buried in the snow. She blinked, as if trying to remember. Then, her expression darkened. They were hunting me, she whispered. Ethan leaned forward. Who? Those things in the storm. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a second. Yes. They want me dead. Ethan didn't like the way she said that, like she had already accepted her fate. Why? He asked. She hesitated. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, she reached up and touched her chest. Not just her chest, something beneath her skin. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What is that? Sarah exhaled shakily. It is why I am still alive. Then the shelter shook violently. Ethan shot to his feet, grabbing his plasma pistol. Sarah flinched, her body tensing. Another tremor, a deep thud from outside. Ethan glanced at the door. The storm was still raging, but something else was out there. Watching. Waiting. And it wasn't going to let them stay hidden for long. The hunters. The violent shake of the shelter sent a ripple of tension through Ethan's body. He gripped the handle of his plasma pistol tighter, his fingers white from the cold metal. The storm outside roared, but this was different. The usual howling wind had a deeper, more sinister quality to it now. The thud outside came again, harder this time. It echoed through the metal walls of the shelter like a warning. Ethan turned to Sarah, who was now on her feet, her violet eyes wide with fear. She seemed to sense it too, the presence outside, looming like a dark shadow. They found us, she whispered, her voice trembling. They are here. Ethan quickly moved to the small window in the shelter, his eyes scanning the blizzard outside. The visibility was near zero, but he could just make out faint figures moving in the storm, their shapes unnaturally tall and fast, with glowing eyes that pierced through the swirling snow. Hunters. The creatures from before. Who are they? Ethan asked, his voice tight. They are the Razhorin, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They are predators, cold-blooded. Their species lives to hunt and kill. Ethan's heart pounded. Why are they after you? She hesitated, her eyes shifting nervously. I carry something. Something they need. I was supposed to be harvested. Her gaze dropped to the crystal beneath her skin, the small glowing object that had become part of her. But I escaped. The Razhorin were known for their ruthless efficiency. No one escaped them. If they wanted her dead, they would stop at nothing. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to hide. The storm was too intense. The creatures were too relentless. The door to the shelter suddenly shuddered as another blow hit it from outside. The metal groaned under the pressure. Ethan's mind raced. They had to act fast. "Can you fight?" he asked. Sarah nodded grimly, her face determined. "I can." But her voice lacked confidence. Ethan could see it in her eyes. The truth was, she was still weak from the cold, and even if she was a fighter, her strength had been drained by the harsh weather and the ordeal she'd endured. Ethan ran to the weapons locker, grabbing a thermal blade and tossing it to her. He quickly armed himself with his plasma rifle and checked his gear. The shelter's walls weren't thick enough to hold off the Razhoran for long. They were relentless, and the pounding on the door was proof that they knew exactly where they were. "We'll make a stand here," Ethan said, voice steady but laced with urgency. "If we fight together. If we run—" He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "We don't survive." Sarah's eyes hardened as she gripped the thermal blade, the weapon glowing faintly with heat. "Then we fight." A loud crack sounded as one of the Razhoran's taloned hands punched through the metal door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and before he could react, the door splintered inward, revealing the monstrous figure of the hunter. It was taller than a man, almost 8 feet of bone and muscle, with sharp, jagged spines running down its back and glowing red eyes that burned through the darkness. Its skin was a dark, leathery black, like something that had been molded by the cold and darkness of the planet itself. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Behind it, more figures emerged from the blizzard, their eyes burning with hunger. The Razhoran. Ethan fired his plasma rifle, the bright blue beam flashing through the air, striking one of the creatures in the shoulder. It staggered back, but didn't fall. It was unharmed. The armor-like skin absorbed the blast with ease. The first Razhoran charge. Sarah stepped forward, her blade flashing through the air. She slashed across its side, but the weapon barely left a scratch on its tough hide. The creature howled, swiping its massive claws at her. She dodged just in time, but the creature's strike shredded her cloak. Ethan fired again, but the creatures were too fast, too strong. They advanced, their long limbs covering the distance in seconds. "We can't hold them off," Ethan shouted, backing away. Sarah's eyes glowed with desperation. "We have to." Suddenly, there was a loud crack from outside the shelter, like something had shattered the ice. The Razhoran stopped for a brief moment, their glowing eyes shifting toward the source of the sound. A sound that wasn't from them. A shadow moved in the snow. Another figure. A second creature, this one smaller, but just as deadly. Ethan's heart skipped. It wasn't just the Razhoran. There were others here too, and they were closing in. "We're surrounded," Ethan muttered as he took another step back. "This is it." But then, as the second group of attackers closed in, Sarah's crystal beneath her skin flared to life. A bright, blinding light exploded from it, throwing the creatures back with such force that they stumbled in the snow. The air buzzed with energy. The Razhoran hissed, their glowing eyes flickering in pain. They looked at each other, uncertain for the first time. But it was clear, Sarah wasn't just an ordinary alien. She was something more. The hunters weren't just after her for food. They were after something much bigger. And now, Ethan understood the true danger they were in. The escape plan. The intensity of the battle left Ethan's pulse racing, his thoughts running wild. The Razhoran had fallen back temporarily, but it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and pressed forward again. The shelter wasn't equipped to withstand another attack, and the creatures were learning. They were adapting to the light pulse from Sarah's crystal. He could feel it too, the change in the air, like the planet itself was holding its breath. The ice underfoot felt different now, like it had become alive aware. Sarah stood still, her eyes closed as she focused, trying to harness the power of the glowing crystal embedded in her skin. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body still weak from the cold, but something within her was stirring, something far beyond the limits of a normal being. Her energy was fluctuating, and every time the crystal pulsed, the air seemed to thrum with power as though it were tapping into a much deeper force, one she didn't fully understand. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead and quickly gathered his gear, all while keeping an eye on the damaged door. It was clear they didn't have much time. "We can't stay here," he muttered. "They're going to come back. And next time, we won't be so lucky." Sarah didn't reply immediately. Her violet eyes flickered open, glowing with an intensity that matched the energy emanating from her crystal. "I know what we need to do," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I can sense them. I can sense what they're after." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What are they after?" Sarah's gaze locked onto him, her expression firm. "They don't want me. They want the crystal. It's not just some artifact. It's a key." "A key to what?" Ethan asked, the tension in his chest growing. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But I have to go to the Temple of the Lost Ones. It's the only place where I can unlock its true power. I can stop them, Ethan. I can end this." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Temple of the Lost Ones. He'd heard rumors of such places on the planet. Ancient ruins buried deep in the ice fields, said to be filled with relics of a civilization that had vanished long before humanity even set foot on this world. The idea that Sarah might be connected to those ruins, to a power so ancient, made him feel like he was stepping into a nightmare. "And how far is this temple?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "A few days' journey," she replied, her voice steadied despite the uncertainty in her words. "But there's a way to get there faster." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "The crystal. It can open a path," Sarah explained. "But I need to focus. I need to connect with it, understand its will. The Razoran are powerful, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. I do." Ethan wasn't entirely convinced, but he had no better options. They could barely hold off the creatures outside, and staying in the shelter would only give them more time to prepare. Their only chance was to run, to escape to this temple, whatever it was, and hope that Sarah could unlock its secrets. "All right, we do it your way," Ethan said, his voice calm but determined. "But we need to move now." Sarah nodded, though she looked pale and exhausted. The power from the crystal was clearly draining her, and Ethan wasn't sure how long she could keep this up. The Razoran wouldn't give them any more time than they had already taken. Before they left, Ethan gathered what supplies they could carry: energy packs, water, a portable heater, and a few weapons. They couldn't afford to be caught unprepared. The storm outside had subsided a little, but the landscape was still an icy wasteland of snow and rock. Ethan adjusted his gear and gave Sarah one last look. She was standing by the entrance, her posture tense but resolute. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah nodded again, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I have to be." Ethan opened the door carefully, peering out into the swirling snow. There was no sign of the Razoran, but they had to assume the creatures were still hunting. There was no telling how long they had before the next attack. He stepped out first, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. Sarah followed, her movements slower than his but no less determined. They started walking into the blizzard, their destination set, the Temple of the Lost Ones. Ethan kept his senses sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The blizzard made visibility almost impossible, and the cold cut through his layers of clothing like 1,000 needles. But his mind was more focused on Sarah's words than the storm. If she was right, if that crystal really could unlock something, then they were heading toward a power that could either save them or destroy them. As they pushed forward, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind howled around them, but the glowing red eyes of the Razoran had faded from his mind. He knew they were still out there, waiting for the right moment. But he had to trust Sarah. If this crystal could really take them to the temple, then maybe, just maybe, they would be able to turn the tide in their favor. But then, as the storm thickened around them, Ethan caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a flicker of movement. His heart dropped. There were more of them, Razhorin, and this time they weren't waiting. They were charging. "Run," Ethan shouted. And with that, they were off, running through the storm, away from the shelter, away from safety, into the heart of the unknown. The final stand. The snowstorm had intensified as Ethan and Sarah pushed forward, their breath clouding in the cold, their footsteps buried almost immediately beneath the relentless falling snow. They had been running for hours, moving away from the shelter, away from the only safety they'd known. And the weight of that decision pressed down on Ethan with each stride. The Razhorin were still pursuing them. He could feel it in his bones. Their hunt was far from over. But they couldn't stop. They had to reach the Temple of the Lost Ones, the only place Sarah believed could help them turn the tide. If the crystal was truly what she said it was, if it could open the path to something powerful enough to stop the Razhorin, then they had no choice but to get there. However, the storm wasn't their only enemy. The creatures were closing in. Ethan's mind raced as they pushed through the snow. The wind howled, biting at his face like sharp needles, and the constant flurry of white disoriented him. But he had to keep his focus. Sarah was struggling now, her movements slow and stiff, her eyes unfocused. The strain of keeping the crystal activated, of holding on to the energy that surged through her body, was clearly wearing her down. Every so often, she would glance at him, her eyes clouded with exhaustion, but she never slowed. She couldn't afford to. They both knew what would happen if they stopped. "They're coming," she said, her voice breathless but tinged with determination. "They know we're close. We have to keep moving." Ethan nodded, gripping his plasma rifle tightly. He knew she was right. The Razhorin didn't give up easily, and they had learned their lesson from the shelter. They wouldn't let their prey escape a second time. The wind grew stronger, the air colder. Ethan's visor beeped in warning. Energy levels dangerously low. The battery packs were beginning to drain, and there was no way to recharge until they reached the temple. They were running on borrowed time. Then they heard it. A sound that made Ethan's blood run cold, a low growl, deep and resonant, echoing from somewhere behind them. The Razhorin were already on their trail. They had been moving silently through the storm, closing the distance with unnatural precision. Ethan turned quickly, his pulse quickening. Sarah's eyes flashed, the violet glow of the crystal intensifying. She could sense them too. "We're not going to make it," she whispered, her voice heavy with both resolve and fear. "No," Ethan said firmly. "We will." There was no choice but to face the truth. They were out of time, and they were outnumbered. The Razhorin would catch them before they reached the temple, unless they made their stand now. Sarah stopped suddenly, turning to face him. Her voice was sharp and focused, no longer weak. "We need to draw them away from the temple entrance. We can't let them know where it is." Ethan took a deep breath. It was risky, dangerous, even, but she was right. If the Razhorin followed them directly to the temple, they wouldn't just be fighting for their lives. They'd be fighting for everything. "We'll set a trap," Ethan said, already scanning their surroundings. The terrain was rough, jagged rocks protruding from the snow, low ridges that offered some cover. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. He started to work quickly, setting up thermal mines he packed earlier, careful to place them in spots that would catch the creatures off guard. The last thing they needed was to be surrounded. They had to make the Razhorin think they were cornered, trick them into charging straight into their ambush. Sarah, now standing at his side, focused her energy on the crystal. She raised her hand toward the sky, her eyes closed in concentration. The crystal pulsed, sending a ripple of energy through the air. The storm around them seemed to shift, as though responding to the power she was channeling. The wind picked up, howling louder than before, but there was something else. An unnatural silence settled over the landscape. The Razhorin were closing in, but they had yet to reveal themselves. They were waiting for the right moment, studying their prey. Ethan took one last look at the battlefield. His heart pounded as he silently prayed they would make it through this. There was no turning back now. A distant shout split the silence, a guttural command from the lead Razhoran. Then, in an instant, they appeared, 5 of them, coming from different angles, moving swiftly through the storm. Their glowing eyes burned bright in the snow, and their claws clicked against the icy ground. Ethan's heart raced. He could hear them getting closer, their every step more deliberate, more certain. But they had walked right into his trap. He nodded at Sarah, signaling her to activate the pulse. The crystal flared again. The air hummed with energy as the Razhoran stepped forward, just as Ethan had predicted. They were too focused on their prey to notice the hidden mines until it was too late. Boom! The first explosion hit with deafening force, throwing snow and debris into the air. One of the Razhoran shrieked in pain as it was thrown backward, its armor cracked open by the blast. The others staggered, momentarily disoriented, their instincts telling them to retreat. But it was too late. Ethan's rifle rang out, the plasma blast striking the creatures before they could recover. One of the Razhoran fell, its body collapsing into the snow, but the others weren't giving up that easily. They charged, their massive forms moving faster than any human could react. Sarah stepped forward, her hand raised toward the remaining hunters. The crystal glowed brighter than ever before, sending waves of force into the ground. The energy was too much for the Razhoran to handle. The shockwave sent them flying back, crashing into the snow, stunned by the sheer power of it. But one last creature remained, the largest and most terrifying of them all, the Alpha Razhoran. It towered above them, its claws extended, its mouth open in a snarl. It advanced, its eyes burning with hatred and determination. Ethan's hand tightened around his plasma rifle, but he knew he couldn't rely on just weapons now. This was going to be the final battle, and they needed more than firepower. "Now, Sarah," Ethan shouted. Sarah closed her eyes, channeling all of the crystal's power. Her voice rang out in a language Ethan didn't understand, but the energy around them surged. The Alpha Razhoran paused, its glowing eyes flickering in confusion, as if sensing the immense force now gathering around them. Then, with a final cry, Sarah unleashed everything. A pulse of pure, unfiltered energy shot from the crystal, striking the Alpha Razhoran directly. The creature howled in pain, its body convulsing as the energy coursed through it. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The very air seemed to crackle with raw power. And then, silence. The Alpha Razhoran fell, its massive body hitting the ground with a heavy thud, the remaining creatures scattering in fear. They had done it. They had won. But the battle wasn't over. Ethan could feel it in his bones. The temple still lay ahead, and something darker was waiting for them there. The sacrifice and the return. The aftermath of the battle left Ethan's body aching, his muscles trembling from the exertion of the fight. The storm had finally begun to wane. The wind lessened, and the heavy snowfall seemed to slow, revealing a sky full of stars far above. The ground around them was littered with the broken forms of the Razhoran, their twisted bodies scattered in the snow. Ethan stood over the remains of the Alpha Razhoran, his plasma rifle still clutched tightly in his hands, though the weapon now felt far too heavy. The adrenaline from the fight had started to wear off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. But as he took in the wreckage of their final stand, his eyes turned toward Sarah. She was standing a few feet away, still breathing heavily, her face pale and strained. Her once glowing crystal had dimmed considerably, its light now a faint pulse beneath her skin. The energy surge she had unleashed had drained her, perhaps more than she'd anticipated. Her eyes were closed as if she was trying to regain some measure of strength, but the weight of the situation was clear in her every movement. Ethan knew what was coming. He stepped toward her, concern etching across his face. "Sarah, you're not okay." She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her expression now, only a quiet acceptance. The crystal, once a beacon of untapped potential, had lost much of its light. I told you, Ethan, she said softly. I can feel it. The temple's power is awakening, but so is mine. Ethan's chest tightened as he caught the meaning behind her words. It wasn't just the Razorin they were facing. It was something bigger, something tied to this temple she kept speaking of, something ancient and dangerous. Where's the temple? He asked, voice barely more than a whisper, as though the wind itself might carry his words away. Sarah nodded in the direction of the distant mountains. They were barely visible now through the clearing snow, but Ethan knew they had to be close. The temple had to be nearby. It had to be. I can guide us, she said, but her voice was strained. But I don't have much left in me, Ethan. Not much at all. Her words hit him like a wave of cold water. He stepped forward, ready to protest, but she raised her hand. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This was always the plan. I knew what I was signing up for. I was the key. The crystal was never meant for me to survive. But you have to make it. You have to get to the temple. Ethan felt his stomach knot. Sarah, no, we can still do this. We've come so far, together. But she only smiled faintly. The energy, the power it's unlocking, it's pulling me in. I won't survive the awakening, Ethan. It's too much for me. Her eyes met his again, and this time, there was no fear, only quiet peace. She had accepted her fate, perhaps even before they had arrived on this planet. But it's not over yet, Sarah continued. You have to go. The temple is waiting. It will give you the strength you need to finish this. She coughed, a slight tremble in her voice. You're not alone, Ethan. Not anymore. Ethan's mind raced, but he knew there was no arguing with her. The raw energy she had unleashed had clearly taken everything she had. There was nothing left for her to give. Her only hope now was to guide him to the temple, and even that was slipping away. Please, Sarah whispered, almost as if pleading with herself more than him. I've seen this. I've seen the future. You can do it. Ethan felt the weight of her words deep in his chest. His heart pounded against his ribs. He was losing her. There was no way around it. But her last wish was clear. The temple was their only chance to defeat the Razorin and whatever else lurked beneath the ice. Sarah took a step back, her body trembling as the crystal inside her began to pulse again. Slower this time, but more intensely. The power was building, gathering, drawing her in. Ethan stepped forward, reaching for her, but she stopped him with a firm hand on his chest. Go, she said, her voice breaking but steady. I'll be with you, even when I'm not. A final tremor shook her body, and she dropped to her knees, the crystal glowing brighter than ever before. The earth around them seemed to shift. The air grew thick with energy, and the temperature dropped once again. It was as if the very planet was reacting to the crystal's power. Then, with a final, mournful sigh, Sarah vanished, her body consumed by a flash of brilliant, otherworldly light. Her energy was now part of the world itself, absorbed into the temple's waiting embrace. Ethan stood frozen in the snow, his heart a mix of loss, regret, and rage. He couldn't believe she was gone. He had just found someone who understood, someone who had fought beside him, someone who had saved his life, and now she was gone. But there was no time to mourn. Not yet. Ethan wiped his eyes, his body trembling. He turned away from the spot where Sarah had been and forced himself to move forward. He couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. He wouldn't let it. He took a deep breath and set his course toward the mountains, toward the temple that had called to Sarah and to him. He knew what lay ahead was not only the last fight of their journey, it was the beginning of something far greater. The temple was not just a structure. It was the final key to stopping the Razorin, to unlocking the true power that had been buried beneath this frozen wasteland for centuries. But as he walked through the snow, Ethan could feel something stirring deep within himself, a connection to Sarah, to the power she had awakened. It was more than just the crystal now. It was the human spirit, the will to survive, the bond between two people who had become more than allies. He was not alone, and he would finish what they had started.